Actually, that is a great move. Highly recommend its full implementation. One, it's supported by the Constitution. Article 243 of the Constitution establishes the NPS, which is the National Police Service, under the command and independent command of the Inspector General of the police. The same Constitution provides for the recruitment process and appointment of the Inspector General of Police. The rigorous nature of that exercise, it is presumed that that office should be very independent. The Constitution further states that an Act of Parliament may give further provisions to give effect to Article 243 and 245 of the Constitution, and actually 244, which brings about the values and principles that NPS should be guided by as they carry out their mandate. Now, that particular provision, that is 243, envisions an independent service, a service that is not subject to the control of any other than the independent command of the Inspector General. However, there is some parts where the DPP has a role with regard to giving directions to the Inspector General to carry out a certain particular investigation, which means there should be clear provisions or clear direction on what kind of investigation the Inspector General will be anticipating. The second one is where the Cabinet Secretary responsible for Interior or Internal Security may give policy directions to the Inspector General. Now, those are the only two instances where the Inspector General may have one or two direction here and there. But although I must say that the Inspector General is appointed eventually by His Excellency the President. Now, the independence of the service is enshrined in the Constitution. Then the National Police Service Act has created, has given further functions to the Inspector General, who is the head of the entire service. The service comprises of other two services, which is APS and KPS. The two other services are under the DIGs, one responsible for KPS and the other one responsible for APS. But the IG is the overall commander of the service. Now, there may be other formations within the service. For example, we have the DCI, we have other formations that are either provided for in law or through administrative frameworks. The Act, the service, that is the NPS Act, has a whole chapter that regulates matters of finance. This is provided for under Section 1, Part 15. Part 15, which provides for financial provisions, that is Section 116 to 122. And it actually says that the National Assembly shall allocate adequate funds to enable the service perform its functions. And it requires Parliament to actually ensure that the service has a separate vote. So the law is very clear, has always been clear that NPS must have its own independent vote away from any other entity. Now, it further states that the Inspector General, by inference, not by mentioning as an accounting officer, shall be responsible for the overall performance of that institution and ensure that every unit, including police stations, police posts, whatever other formation that there is adequately funded. It further requires the Inspector General to prepare annual estimates and requires him to prepare plans, work plans and other activities and how they're supposed to be funded. In essence, that particular act envisions an independent service with its own funds and managing its own funds, answerable to Parliament for purposes of accounting for the same. Now, this having been the law, there are also other laws that regulate matters of public finance management. For example, the PFMA, and the ministry that is responsible for that is definitely the Treasury. So there are instances where, and not only instances, but that particular fund is supposed to be in that regulated within the manner that is known and established by the Constitution. That is Chapter 12 and also the PFMA Act. So this has been the law since 2011. 2010, the Constitution, and 2011, the National Police Service Act. How can the Inspector General be designated as an accounting officer? The law clearly assumes that is his role. But by being a government entity, a national government entity, the Public Finance Management Act also provides for how an officer can be designated as an accounting officer for purposes of carrying out public finances, managing them and accounting for them. Financial autonomy means positive service delivery for the people of Kenya. This is where the Inspector General will be held accountable directly for performance or otherwise for the service. So in essence, it will foster independence of the office of the IG, independence of the service to carry out independent functions without interference from any quarters. Then we, as Ipoa, will be able to hold the IG accountable for purposes of, on behalf of Wanjiko, whether certain services have been provided. Why we consider this important is that, for example, we investigate deaths that have occurred within police premises, those detention facilities. Most of them are in not so good condition. Therefore, we need to be able to hold accountable. When we do our inspections and when we do monitoring activities, we are able to point out things that can be resolved within a short time of period. Initially, the process as is, before the implementation of His Excellency the President Directive, is that such issues cannot be addressed as soon as we may want. And this, of course, has caused a lot of suffering for many people. We have recommended as the Independent Policing Oversight Authority to have CCTV cameras installed in all detention facilities for obvious reasons. Their investigation will be easier in considering that the cameras will be able to record in occurrences within those detention facilities and so on. So with that, we see a lot of, we will see in changes that may not have required a lot of time to implement. And then the question of prioritization. When the IG comes up with his own work plan, the activities, and of course projects for them, and there are funds, adequate funds allocated to the office of the IG or the service, then it is possible to implement them and prioritize instances or things that may serve the people better. So I think that is also another area. Professionalization of the service, meeting members of the service and addressing their concerns. Also transparent and speedy resolution of conflicts, actually by Internal Affairs Unit, because you know Internal Affairs Unit falls directly under the Inspector General. So we'll be able to have issues resolved within time. Sometimes investigations require a lot of resources. So when you're able to request for funds and they come up and they actually prioritize, such kind of investigations will be concluded in good time. Now, I've talked about improvement in terms of detention facility, training institutions. The funding of training institutions is everything. For us, professionalization of the service has a lot to do with culture, has a lot to do with training. So we'd want a service that is able, with the resources now, it will be possible to train officers in modern ways of addressing and dealing with crimes, community policing and so on. With resources, the IG is able to facilitate forums that can help him engage members of the public and his officers to engage members of the public. Acquisition of modern public order management tools. That is something also we may want. With the fund, we are assured this is something that is a priority. If you look at the statistics of the kind of complaint we've had, most of them have been in relation to public order management. So with proper tooling, proper equipment, as we have recommended from time to time, modernized approach to dealing with such kind of issues, with funds, we are assured as Ipoa, this will improve how the service has been conducting itself. We are talking about also funding with regard to training on forensic specialities and equipping them accordingly. So priorities will change, and I'm sure with that allocation, the IG will be able, because he's answerable now directly to the public and to the Assembly and to His Excellency the President, he'll be able to do a lot more. We are also talking about timely distribution of resources with need of each and every police station and region. Initially, some of the far-fetched areas, for example, you understand the country is a bit vast, so you can be sure some of them may not be reached. But with this kind of fund, the IG would be able to know where actually there is need, and prioritization will be of essence. Allowances to members of the service, remuneration to members of the service, and many other things. We want to believe that with the fund, there will be better consideration of their issues within the service, and the same will be addressed. This, of course, does not take away the role of the Cabinet Secretary responsible for internal for security to deal with matters of policy. From time to time, in fact, if you look at Section 120 of the NPS Act, it requires that the Inspector General, as soon as the service has prepared its annual estimate, to submit to the Cabinet Secretary for consideration and approval. And the only challenge with that clause is that it states that once the CS has approved, then the IG cannot make any alterations. But with the new development, I think there'll be a lot more of engagement and consensus in some issues, and most importantly, prioritization. Basically, this is excellent news for us, and also on behalf of members of the public. A serviced NPS means a professionalized NPS. And we all know the benefits of independence. It allows you to carry out your duties without interference. If you're only answerable to National Assembly or Parliament and His Excellency the President, then definitely you have an obligation to perform your duties and carry them out as effective and as required by the Constitution. We as Ipoa would be extremely delighted if this fund is, if this financial autonomy is finally implemented, because we have from time to time recommended the same. We have recommended that the service have its own finances separated as required by the NPS Act. The NPS Act, the same way the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution has financial autonomy, ODPP is a constitutional independent office. So does NPS, so does Auditor General's Office, so does Controller of Budget Office. So that financial autonomy means independence, and therefore means better services and transparency, accountability in how they carry out their duties. Of course, there are challenges, a little bit of this and that when it comes to financial autonomy. You can be sued and sue in your own capacity. So that corporate entity is something that may require a substantive legislative document to give it autonomy, that, to whom much is given, much is expected. Then at the same time, a bit of this and theatre to tweak the law to make it better implementable. Who is the accounting officer? Of course, in this case, maybe the Inspector General, but also there is need to have a secretariat, because the Inspector General is exercising command over her service of so many other officers and other critical duties that, of course, he's obligated by Constitution and law to undertake. So he may require some secretariat under him to enable him execute this very noble initiative. Sometimes in government we have seen that where you have financial autonomy, you may have treasury seconding accounting officers or nominating one from your end, and they run the docket of finance in a manner that is prescribed by the PFMA Act and Public Finance Management Act and the regulations thereunder. Then it calls for transparency. Security being a sensitive sector, not everything that can be subjected to public scrutiny. There are sensitive issues that may not require that they're exposed to public knowledge. And such, we have dealt with them, like in the instance of NIS Act and KDF Act. There are procedures on how security institutions may be audited, or their accounts checked and assessed by other entities. So basically, service delivery to the citizen is critical for us. Professionalization and preservation and protection of fundamental freedoms, both for officers and members of the public, is critical for us. So we are talking about welfare. Welfare of members of the service will be improved. So will also the ripple effect of a service that is independent, well-resourced, is proper and good service delivery to mwananchi. I also want to indicate that by law, Ipoa is obligated to require of the Inspector General to compensate victims of police misconduct or brutality, and the same is provided for under Section 10(1)(t) of the NPS Act. Actually, the Act knows that the IG is the accounting officer. He is required by law to ensure that compensation. Now, the process of how to determine how much one is worth and so on is something that can be considered by either courts of law or an establishment of a structure within the NPS that can assess how much a person, a victim, may be eligible for, and so on. So the law itself is very clear that the IG actually ought to be independent and have financial autonomy.